Welcome. My name is Dennis Doverspike, and this is a brief talk on the history and basics of public sector assessment and merit-based testing. This talk is designed for those with relatively little knowledge of testing, and it briefly goes over the history of specifically public sector assessment and also the idea of merit-based testing. As I said, my name is Dennis Doverspike. I've had a long career in industrial organizational psychology, primarily at the University of Akron, but also in consulting. I also have 40 years of experience in developing and administering tests. So when we talk about tests, most of us have had a lot of experience about tests. We probably have well-developed feelings or attitudes towards tests. Some of us probably like tests. Many of us may not like tests. All of us probably have taken tests at many different points in our lives. Some of us may even have had children who have taken tests as well. And we've probably taken many kinds of tests. Classroom or school tests that our teachers give us, tests to get into college or graduate school, and even maybe civil service tests or tests for employment. Or if we went to a psychologist, tests from a psychologist. But what is a test? Well, there's sort of a formal and then a more general definition. A psychological test can be defined as a sample behavior representing some psychological construct. It's a sample or sampling of behavior or a construct, and it can even be a random sample of such behavior, which has the properties of objectivity, structure, reliability, and validity. Of course, an alternate definition of a test is that, or an expanded definition, is that a test is anything used by a psychologist to make a decision, or anything used by an employer or an agent of such an employer or an educational institution to make an employment or education decision. For many people, when they think about testing, they think about testing as beginning with the famous Stanford Binet intelligence tests in France in the early 1900s. However, our history of testing is much older. The Chinese started using tests for civil service exams back as far as 2200 before the Common Era. In China, around 1115 before the Common Era, exams started being used for candidates for public office. And those exams weren't really that much different from what we might see today. Those exams were a mix of written, oral, and work sample. And this continued in China till about 1905. Around the 1800s, the British East India Company started using tests and really using tests throughout the world for employment purposes. In employment and also education or academia in the West, around 1100, the use of work samples emerged for those individuals who wanted to be considered masters in some occupation. Also, universities started using oral examinations. These oral exams were used not just with students, but with those who wanted to be considered for positions as lecturers or professors. This might be considered sort of an early comprehensive or comps exam. So we see that around 1700 to 1800, the West took note of this Chinese approach to testing, especially the British East India Company, and began to use tests for private sector employment testing. Around 1791, France actually began to use tests in the form of an early civil service exam. And also around this time, the Jesuit and German universities started using more traditional tests at education or university settings. And finally, around 1855, in the United Kingdom, we see the emergence of civil service examinations. These were very similar to what we might see today. These were early employment examinations for selection into Her Majesty's Civil Service. And it really was sort of an early intelligence test. So an intelligence test even before Binet. In terms of the United States and public sector testing, from 1850 to 1900, a lot of US government agencies started doing testing. And they used a test that would look a lot like the modern IQ test. You can see here there's an advertisement that describes a special examination for the State Department. And a lot of those topics were ones that you might still find today. Obligatory subjects were penmanship, arithmetic, English, general geography, diplomatic history, government and international law. So very much a very comprehensive type of knowledge, ability, or achievement test. Of course, another big date was 1881. President Garfield was shot by a disgruntled job applicant, and this led to a great deal of civil service reform, including the Pendleton Act of 1883. So in the United States, what we would call civil service testing started to emerge. Civil service testing required what were called competitive examinations. Though these competitive examinations were often similar to general knowledge or IQ tests, and at the time they were often seen as actually advancing diversity and inclusion rather than hurting diversity and inclusion. And even back in the early 1850s, late 1800s, there were concerns, though, about test security. From about 1850 on, also, private companies in the United States started using employment tests for selection purposes. So in terms of then our history of psych and ed testing, we have that as background. Some other big dates were the 1800s, the quantitative nature of science. During this time period, scientists argued for and emphasized that science must be quantitative. It must be based on measurement, must be based on numbers. Of course, this presented a challenge for psychology. 1869, Sir Francis Galton, The Study of Genius, studied twins, came up with the normal curve, set up one of the first testing laboratories. In 1900, and also in the 1900s, we see, again, in education, this idea of trying to differentiate education, or who's an educated person, from intelligence, and the idea that intelligence and education were not the same thing. Then in 1904, Benet Simon, Benet was a French psychologist and Theodore Simon was his student, were commissioned by the French government to develop tests, the early IQ tests. And then 1904, 1906, Terman brought these IQ tests to the United States. So this is just an example of the 1916 Stanford Binet, some sample items for 12-year-olds. We see some vocabulary items, fairly difficult, some practice problem-solving items, some grammar items, interpretation items, similarity items, and memory items. And probably if we were to look at an intelligence test today, it would not be that different. There are many different systems for distributing rewards, whether it be jobs or pay or education, but a fundamental idea in the United States has been that the distribution of reward should be based on merit. Now, of course, then we can get into how should merit be defined. If we look at our federal history of employment, or federal history of government employment, we can look at the period between 1789 and 1828 as being the privileged stage, or some people call it the elite stage. This was the stage during which public jobs in the United States were initially shared among what were called elite leaders. That small group of upper-class property owners who had led the American Revolution. Now, this idea is not, though, necessarily the opposite of rewarding jobs based on merit. In fact, it is the idea of basing jobs on merit, because having served your country, having been part of the American Revolution, was seen as defining merit. So the privileged stage was actually seen as rewarding people for merit, the merit of having been one of those individuals willing to sacrifice for their country. We still see this idea today with various kinds of veteran preference. Then 1829 to 1882, we would argue, is the patronage stage, aka the spoils system. And then in 1871, though, we see the federal civil service system established, although this initially failed because of a lack of funding. So again, in terms of federal history, at least the federal United States history, President James Garfield was assassinated July 2nd, 1881. He was assassinated by a rejected office seeker. That then pushed the United States into using civil service reform, and this led to the Pendleton Act of 1883. The Pendleton Act created a Civil Service Commission, which was tasked with creating a system of competitive examinations. So the federal history can be seen as containing or emphasizing three fundamental principles. And those three principles are: one, fair and open competition for federal jobs; two, admission to the competitive service only on the basis of a neutral examination; and three, protection of those in service from political influence and coercion. And again, as we mentioned, this emphasis on merit was actually seen as increasing diversity and inclusion. But again, from the very beginning, there were concerns about test security. Fast forwarding a little in our history, in 1978, the Civil Service Reform Act passed. This was an update to the Pendleton Act of 1883. It defined the principles for a merit system as being: recruitment should be from qualified individuals, from appropriate sources, in an endeavor to achieve a workforce from all segments of society. And selection and advancement should be determined solely on the basis of relative ability, knowledge, and skills, after fair and open competition, which assures that all receive equal opportunity. We're now going to look at merit and civil service reform in Ohio. I could have chosen other states, but I chose Ohio because I'm from Ohio and I sort of know Ohio better. I certainly could have chosen other states. Ohio went through civil service reform from 1902 to 1913 and instituted a basic merit system for local governments. It was one of only 3 states prior to 1935 to go through this kind of civil service reform, the others being New York and Massachusetts. So civil service, according to the Ohio Constitution, civil service appointments and promotions in the civil service of the state, the several counties and cities, shall be made according to merit and fitness, to be ascertained as far as practicable by competitive examinations. Laws shall be passed providing for the enforcement of this provision. So there's 2 important words that I've highlighted there. Well, 1, 2, 3, 5 important words that I've highlighted there. 1 being merit and fitness, and 2 being competitive examinations. So the Ohio Constitution specifically recognizes merit and fitness and competitive examinations. So this is further defining what is meant by merit and examinations in the Ohio Revised Code. An examination may include an evaluation of such factors as education, training, capacity, knowledge, manual dexterity, and physical or psychological fitness. An examination shall consist of 1 or more tests in any combination. Tests may be written, oral, physical, demonstrations of skill, or an evaluation of training and experiences, and shall be designed to fairly test the relative capacity of the persons examined to discharge the particular duties of the position for which appointment is sought. Tests may include structured interviews, assessment centers, work simulations, examinations of knowledge, skills, and abilities, and any other acceptable testing methods. If minimum or maximum requirements are established, they shall be specified in the examination announcement. And it goes further to say that it shouldn't be related to political or religious affiliations or other factors. Okay, so this leads us to: how do we define merit, especially when we look at Ohio and the federal government? Well, we could probably offer a operational or practical definition of merit, that it's defined by the process of defining merit, which of course is what we mean by an operational definition. And so when we talk about merit, we tend to mean that it should be by or identified, at least for initial employment purposes, by competitive examination. And that's frequently been taken to mean that that competitive examination should be as objective as possible. In other words, should minimize subjectivity or subjective elements as much as possible. It's also often meant or been interpreted as meaning a multiple choice test, although clearly, as we've seen, it's not limited to the above. So clearly, as we've seen, there's nothing to limit it to objective tests or multiple choice tests. However, the history of merit testing for government positions has been that it's frequently been defined as that, objective and multiple choice. But there's nothing necessarily to limit it to that. And we would certainly not want to imply that it should be limited to objective or multiple choice. So my own personal view is we should give a lot more thought to what we mean by merit. For example, in Canada, the view of merit has been expanded to include organizational needs, where representativeness falls under organizational needs. In the United States, the Department of Justice has often argued for overturning narrow definitions of merit, especially those often found in union contracts. So going back and just summarizing our merit principles, we can say that we believe that one, there are individual differences in merit, that there exist then stable individual differences in merit, that two, merit can in fact be measured, that three, merit should be based on job-related characteristics, and that four, merit should be measured through an open, transparent competition. In the public sector, a competition often then means a transparent competition. It's often been interpreted in the public sector sort of like the Olympics. So the fastest runner in the world does not always win in the Olympics. It's the fastest runner on that day. Similarly, in the public sector, it's not necessarily the person with the most potential for the job that gets the day, for the most potential for the job that gets appointed or that has the highest score that day. But it's the person who gets the highest score, regardless of their actual ability, that is seen as having the highest merit and therefore is awarded the job. Although there's the caveat that although oftentimes public sector employment is based on a straightforward rank ordering where we take the highest ranked person, there are other alternatives we see. For example, sometimes we find the rule of 3 or the rule of 10 or even larger bands used. The rule of 3 just means you take the top 3 individuals and then the decision maker, the manager, the mayor, the governor, picks from those 3 the individual they see as most suitable for the job. Okay, are there alternatives to testing for merit? Certainly there are. Some of the alternatives would be patronage or giving jobs based on political support, nepotism, seniority, which is a principle we use a lot in the United States, marital status, which would be illegal in the United States. Of course, some of these would be perhaps illegal in the United States, societal position, education, protected class, lack of merit. So there would be, some who would argue that instead of giving opportunities in jobs or education to those with the most merit, we should give them to those with the least merit because they most need that opportunity. And then random selection for jobs or educational opportunities. A concept we haven't addressed to this point is fitness. If you go back, you remember that we talked about being able to test for both merit and fitness, but we really haven't talked about fitness. And again, to be truthful, in the literature, you don't see fitness addressed as much. I think there's 2 interpretations we can make of fitness. One interpretation would be that fitness refers to what in the selection research or vocational literature we often regard as fitness. That is, someone could be seen as having a good job fit or a good fit to the organization or even a good psychological fit to the job or the organization. And so fitness can be seen as a way of bringing in personality testing. We can also talk about fitness for duty. So are they psychologically prepared to do the job? For example, with police officers, this is often tested through the MMPI or some similar test. Okay, that brings me to the end of my brief talk on the history of testing, especially public sector assessment and merit testing. If you have any questions, you can send them to me at dennisdoverspike@doverspikeconsulting.com. Thank you very much, and have a great day.